So now we're moving on to the historical story of persecution. And in this section, we just are asking the question again and again in some ways, when is persecution successful? Meaning, in what conditions does persecution damage or even destroy the church as opposed to reviving it? Because it's quite common to hear people say, doesn't persecution always revive the church? Well, that's a very good question, and it was most famously put by Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, who made the statement that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And of course, we know what he means. We know the value of a martyr like no one else in showing the world the value of Christ. But it wasn't true in Tertullian's own city, Carthage. The Islamic persecution in North Africa, running from maybe 650 to 1000 AD, did finish Christianity off permanently in large areas of North Africa. I remember this coming home to me very powerfully when I was living in Hong Kong in the 1980s and in the 1990s. I would visit a house church leader across the border in Guangzhou called Samuel Lam. And he had a 3-story house that was devoid of all domestic furniture. It was full of pews, and he could cram nearly 1,200, mostly young people, into his services. And he was unique in the era for courting publicity and international attention as a kind of protective strategy. When Dr. Billy Graham made his heralded visit to China in 1988, he spoke in Samuel Lam's church, even though it had no legal status. Anyway, every time Samuel Lam would meet visitors, he would have this little mantra that he would trot out, and he would say, "Persecution promotes growth." And he would repeat the phrase, sometimes 5 or 6 times. Now, Samuel Lam was dead right about that being the story of the Chinese church in probably the last 50 years. Since 1949, the Chinese church numbered maybe 700,000 at the time. Now, it's over 100 million. And the bulk of that growth was in the 1980s following the terrible persecution of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76. But Samuel Lam was dead wrong if you look back not 50 years, but 1,500 years in China. 4 times, Christianity came to China and initially took hold, and then it was persecuted severely and fatally wounded. Christianity was first brought to China by Nestorian Christians in the 600s, but they were persecuted out of existence by a Buddhist emperor a couple of centuries later. All that's left is a stele with quotations in Xi'an. Christianity came again in the 12th century, this time led by John of Montecorvino. They managed to baptize 6,000 believers in Beijing. But again, persecution arose and left not a trace. And then famously, in the 15th century, we had the coming of the Jesuit mission, spearheaded by Matteo Ricci, and he made great inroads, especially among the elite. But then an emperor arose, took against them, and they were finished. The 4th great wave was in the 19th century, the Protestant missionary expansion, with literally hundreds of missionaries heading into the Chinese interior, famously spearheaded by Hudson Taylor. And they made great inroads. They built hospitals and schools as well as churches. In over 100 years, with the outbreak of the Second World War, it was estimated there were 700,000 Christians in China. Though someone said, Pearl Buck was her name, that they had made as little difference to Chinese culture as a finger drawn through water. And of course, they were persecuted significantly out after the Communist Party took over in the 1950s. So if Samuel Lam had known the history of persecution in his own country, and we can't blame him, because part of the problem of being a persecuted Christian is lack of access to educational and theological resources. He probably would not have recited his mantra quite so confidently. Persecution promotes growth? Only sometimes. And so we're left with the question, in what circumstances does persecution tend to kill the church as opposed to reviving it? And I will argue as we go through these great 5 global persecutions that there are 2 factors most significant in fatally weakening, if not destroying, Christianity altogether. One is what I call the time element. This is when persecution lasts from generation to generation. Christianity, it seems, and any other religion for that matter, seems to have little defense against persecution when it lasts for 50, 100, 150 years or even longer. The second is what we call the totality element, which is where the persecutor creates a culture that is utterly inhospitable to the daily exercise of the Christian faith. When a society is set up to exclude or marginalize Christianity, then over time, it just becomes too hard to keep swimming against the tide. And Islamic societies are very brilliant at this. They have managed even to make the Christians of the Middle East feel like they're not indigenous at all, but second-class interlopers, even though their presence and culture predates the Islamic one. So we're offering this out as a possible explanation that when these 2 elements come together, the time element and the totality element, it becomes nearly impossible for Christianity to keep transmitting its faith and successfully indigenize, because the society itself is set up to repel the exercise of Christian witness, and it makes the Christian fight every day to be distinctive, and over time, over a very long time, weariness sets in until one day it becomes the easiest thing in the world to convert away from the Christian faith. And notice that's not about violence necessarily. Scott Sunkist, formerly the Dean of Fuller Theological Seminary, he argued that persecution tends to revive the church when it is severe but intermittent, or severe but of a very short duration. Violence, if it's quite short-lived, can revive the church. But if persecution casts a blanket in the long term over the daily exercise of the faith, then the Christian church can be smothered permanently. And Samuel Moffat, who was a great missionary to Korea, urged us to think of it all in 2 ways. He said, imagine the church as a tree. When persecution has the effect of trimming the branches, in the case of, say, a short and sharp persecution, it revives the church in the same way as pruning is good for the growth of the tree. But when the axe is taken to the trunk of the tree, as in a long and devastating persecution, the tree dies, and there cannot be any fruiting.